Okay.
Okay.
Great.
Okay, great. Fantastic. Oh, sincere apologies for that.
Once more from the top. Bom dia a todos. Eu sou Andrew Nevis, da Programa de Pós-Graduação Linguística da UFRJ, e eu estou extremamente feliz de dar boas-vindas mais uma vez, ou pela primeira vez, para Nancy Kula, Tonal Change and Tone Perception. I'm very interested in hearing about the perception, and I'm sure all of you are as well, in Bemba. Nancy.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So really great to be here, and apologies for the sort of shaky start. So I'll just go right into it. So this is the structure of my talk. I'm going to sort of give a sort of very short introduction to Bemba tone, and Bemba is a Bantu language. I'll say a little bit more about that. And then I want to talk a little bit more about the process. I want to talk about ternary spreading in Northern Bemba and in Copperbelt Bemba, and then a bit on some variation that we see in ternary spreading. And essentially, I then want to move on to talking about whether there is to test experimentally, whether there is a mental representation of this ternary spreading pattern, because it's exceptional in what we expect from phonology. So there will be a sort of short production experiment, and then a perception experiment, and then if we have time, a very, very short follow-up experiment 3, which is really, really very short. And then I will conclude with some findings and conclusions. So this is the basics on Bemba and tone. So Bemba is a Central Bantu language, which is spoken mainly in Zambia, but also in parts of the DRC, which is the Democratic Republic of Congo. So Zambia is sort of in the middle of sort of Africa, with it's in Central Africa, which is totally landlocked by other countries. So there's sort of no access to the water directly. There are about 2.3 million speakers, and there's also a very high number of second language speakers. So a lot of work has been done on the structure of Bemba, and in particular here, the ones that I quote here are very classic works which have worked on Bemba tone. So Guthrie did his thesis in London at SOAS in 1945 on Bemba tone, and then these other classic works, 55, 56, 77, are really the works which have done the first basic studies on Bemba tone. So what I'll be looking at today's work, I've been doing with a colleague at the University of Albany, Lee Bickmore. And we've done sort of a number of papers in which we are sort of looking at the structure of tone and what we see today. And this is really work that is coming from there. So very basic stuff on Bemba structure. So there is a contrast in vowel length in Bemba, which is what we see in the first examples. So there's the first word, Ukushika, has got a short vowel, and the second one, Ukushika, has got a long vowel. So that's going to be important. In terms of tone, the tone-bearing unit is the mora. So what we see is if you have a long vowel, then it counts as having a high tone on 2 adjacent vowels. Verbs, of course, have also got a lexical contrast in terms of tone. So you've got the 2 words in A and B, where the first one has got a low versus followed by a high tone, which means to weave. And then the second one has got a 2 high tones. So the first one, weave, Luka, and the second one, Luka. So a sort of difference in what the tones are. But apart from this grammatical use of tone to distinguish words lexically, you also use tone grammatically, and we are sort of going to see examples of that. So you essentially, within some tense aspect marking, you use tone as well. So in terms of the dialectology of Bemba, I'm going to sort of talk about a change which is happening from Northern Bemba, which is up where the orange circle is, and coming to Copperbelt Bemba, which is where the green circle is. Where the yellow one, Half Moon, is an area called Luapula province, where there's another dialect of Bemba that's spoken. But today we're only going to talk about this one, moving over to here. So this is a map of Zambia. There are about 75 languages that are spoken in Zambia. So each of these little numbers that you see here are examples of places where different languages are spoken in each of these areas, and there are many changes. This is really quite an old map. So I want to talk about these 2 dialects and contrast Northern Bemba and Copperbelt Bemba. So Northern Bemba is what is considered to be the place where the original inhabitants of Bemba speakers were, and it's what people consider to be the main dialect. If people talk to you and ask, do you speak proper Bemba, then they think that you have to come from the north, and you come from the northern area. But then in the Copperbelt province, I think about maybe just over 100 years ago, there was loads of migration from the north to the Copperbelt area because one of the main minerals or in Zambia is copper, and there's a lot of mining, and there was an area where the mining was, so a lot of people migrated to go and work in the Copperbelt areas from since maybe the 1920s. And there is now this dialect which is in the Copperbelt area. So the contrast in terms of the Bemba is that in Northern Bemba, essentially, Bemba there is surrounded by other dialects of Bemba. So there are also many other dialects of Bemba. I think there are up to 14 different dialects. So it's spoken in an area where Bemba is the dominant language and it's surrounded by other dialects. In the Copperbelt province, it moved into an area where there are many other languages spoken as well. They are all Bantu languages. So there's Lamba is one of the main big languages that was spoken in this area. So here we are seeing an interaction between Bemba and other languages. So my reference to Copperbelt Bemba is not quite mean something like Town Bemba, which a lot of people talk about, and which is a language which was sort of developed on the mines when people were working together with an influx of different languages, and there was sort of like a sort of dialect that came up and which was used on the mines. So my use, that's also something that's really very interesting, and there's a lot of great anthropological work that's been done on that. But my interest here is essentially in a Bemba dialect, which has just emerged by people who moved from the north to the Copperbelt and didn't necessarily have to have anything to do with the mining, but people have just come to be settled in the Copperbelt. So myself, I come from the Copperbelt province. My parents were born in the north, and they moved to the Copperbelt province, and they did not do any mining. So essentially, I'm kind of looking at that, which is a high number of people who essentially just migrated and trying to understand the changes which are going on in the languages based on that. So there are two central processes that are important in terms of a very, very quick run through of Bemba tone. Two processes, and one is going to be the main one that we are going to talk about. So one is unbounded spreading, and essentially this means you've got a high tone in a word, like in the examples in 1a. So to the right-hand side, you see a va, which has got a high tone on it, and high tone is marked by a high accent, and everything else that doesn't have a tone is essentially low-toned. So just very quickly, I know people sort of probably know this, but in terms of Bantu languages, in terms of the verb structure, what you have here on the right-hand side, this va is usually a subject marker, is followed by a tense aspect marker. So here, ka is a future marker, and then the verb form is always going to be fika. So what in English we would translate as they will arrive, the they is this va, the will is this ka part, and then the fika is arrived. So this is the underlying form that we assume that the verb has the high tone is only from the va, but what you get on the surface is that this high tone spreads right up to the end of the domain. You see this in the second example as well, doing exactly the same thing. So why do we not think these are the lexical forms where we've got the high tone from the left to the right? Is because we've got forms like the third one. So tu is a first plural subject marker, which doesn't have a high tone. And then with the same verb, so the ka and the vila, it doesn't stay high. So this is vakavila, so ta 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 ta, going up, and this is tukavila, so tu 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 tu, just kind of low. So this is kind of what tells us that we think this high tone in vakavila is coming from the subject marker. So that's an example of unbounded spreading. And then we've got bounded spreading, which is where this ternary spreading comes in. So in this case, we've got very similar structured verbs, but what we see is that the high tone doesn't spread to the end of the domain, but it only spreads partially. So here it's spreading 3 times. So from va, we spread to ka, we spread to fik, but the a still has a low tone. And the context, it's a little bit more complex than this, but simplifying, the context in which we get this ternary spreading is usually when there's a following constituent. And it's something to do with phonological phrasing, but the details are not so important. So the difference between this and the previous example is that there was no following constituent in the previous example. It was just vakafika, they will arrive, an utterance that ends in itself. But if you say they will arrive tomorrow, vakafika mailo. So you go ta 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 3 times, but then you fall before you say the word for tomorrow, mailo. And I think that's enough to say on this. So in terms of a contrast between Northern Bemba and Copperbelt Bemba, which is what NB and CB stand for, in terms of unbounded spreading, they do exactly the same thing. They look identical because the va here, which is in bold, spreads a high tone right to the end of the domain. So we can't distinguish the dialects tonally with respect to unbounded spreading. They look the same. When we come to bounded spreading, what we see is that in Northern Bemba, it's binary in that there's only one spread. So this va, high tone, which is lexically high, spreads only once to the next syllable, whereas in Copperbelt Bemba, it spreads 2 times, as we already saw in the preceding examples. So here there's a contrast in that in Copperbelt Bemba, it's ternary, and in Northern Bemba, it's binary. And then some of the questions that come up is, how has this developed? And could it be that actually, you know, in Northern Bemba, clearly these speakers spoke this dialect previously where they had binary spreading, but by virtue of moving to the Copperbelt, we see some change that has happened in the language, and one can speculate how this has happened. And in terms of explanation, one could think, well, maybe there was a further application of this tone doubling, that you sort of have tone doubling once and then you double again. So there's a reapplication of this binary spreading over time, which has now resulted into this ternary spreading. And in this case, one might want to say that actually, and this is something that we have thought about with my colleague Lee Bickmore, that maybe what we see as ternary spreading on the surface is not a single process, but it might be something where we have high doubling and then something which we call secondary high doubling, so that you sort of get this, it's a staged, you know, ternary span. And some of the evidence that we think about that make you think that maybe that might be the case, something like the examples in 7. So it seems as if you could distinguish binary spreading and ternary spreading by the fact that the high doubling can spread to the very final vowel, which is what we see here. So las, it has got a high tone, it's lexically high, it spreads onto the final vowel. And that seems to be a case of binary spreading because there is nowhere else to spread to. But if you look at the example in 8, there is a ternary domain here where this the high tone from the R could spread to the E and then could spread to the R, but this doesn't happen. And this is in the Copperbelt dialect. So it's really, this is kind of maybe something that could make you think that, well, maybe there are 2 processes that are going on, and this is what we conclude with Lee, that there's high doubling, and then there is this secondary high doubling, and actually these 2 processes have got different constraints. So high doubling can double to a final vowel, but the secondary high doubling, which is the one which makes it ternary, can't spread to the end of the domain. So essentially, this is just one way of analyzing it, and it's not necessarily the way that you know, I think it's the only way that it can be. So looking at these examples, there are a few cases. So this is in the interest of full disclosure. There are cases where you see that the ternary spread is really ternary. It's 3 vowels and it's 3 moras. So here, when we look at 9, there's a long vowel, and then if this was the first high tone, it spreads to the second one, and it spreads to the third one in law, and that looks like a ternary domain. If you have a short vowel followed by a short vowel followed by a long vowel, then we have spread 1, 2, and on the long vowel it only spreads on the first mora, and the same thing that we see in 9. So we see a fall here on londolola or shika. You know, you sort of see you sort of have a fall there, essentially meaning it's counting 3 moras. But there are some examples like in 11 which sort of don't seem to follow this pattern, and this always seems to happen when you have a short vowel, like in va, which is red and highlighted here, followed by a long vowel. So in those cases, it seems as if you spread through the whole long vowel and then go onto the third vowel as well. Because if it was really purely Moraic, we may think that, well, it should end at the end of the long vowel, because then we would have had 3 moras. So of course one could think, well, maybe it's syllabic, so it has to be 3 syllables. So the spreading domain of ternary, the ternary domain is syllabic, and that would be great for answering 11 and 10, but it wouldn't be great for resolving 9, which clearly only involves 2 syllables. So there is some noise in the data. So I just wanted to sort of put that out there, that there's some noise in the data. It's not so clean all the time. And there's something about having a short followed by a long vowel that seems to bring in this extra spread. But also it's not spreading up to the penultimate vowel, which we see in other languages like in Chichewa, because here there's a penultimate vowel to which it doesn't spread. So it's not quite the same as saying you're only spreading up to a penultimate position. You're clearly only adding an additional spread, and you're not spreading onto the fifth mora. So ternary spreading, at least in Bemba, is important to mark phrasal distinctions because it helps us, in particular in the case in Bemba, to distinguish phonological phrasing, which I'm happy to talk about in the question time if people are interested. But having a ternary domain in itself is a little bit problematic for phonology because it violates locality. So if we think that there has to be locality between a trigger and a target, then it's not so good to have a ternary domain. And also if you are a representationally based phonology like I am, a phonologist like I am, then you worry about structures. And you know that both in phonology and in syntax, we believe in binary structures. So therefore, I mean, you could have it leveled one on top of another, but you of course think that, what does this mean if it's in one domain? Does it mean that we have got a ternary branch? So this made me get kind of interested in thinking about whether this really is something which is represented for the speakers of Copperbelt Bemba. But before I come to those, here are some cases where there's some work that has been done in Bantu where people have talked about ternary spread. So in Shona dialects, there's really classic work from Scott Myers and also from Mary Pastor more recently. In Ikalanga, in Tswana. Ikalanga and Tswana are languages from Botswana. And then there's a Gur language, which is in West Africa at the time and has worked on where there's also ternary spreading. And then Sukuma is the last example, which is a language from Tanzania. And most of the analysis, what's interesting about most of the analysis in this is that it always, there seems as if there's a way of avoiding saying that it's ternary. So for example, Kreisels in the Tswana sort of says that it's not, where you start counting the span is not from the trigger. So you ignore the trigger and then you create a foot after that. And the foot is where, is what then gives you the domain of the ternary spread. Very recent work in the exciting new Radical journal from Mary Pastor, the 2020 paper. She is like one of the first works where she sort of just says it is tone tripling, and she's got a constraint which essentially says high tone tripling. So just sort of saying there are ternary domains and there are ternary spans, and we just have to move to the stage in our understanding of phonology to say that this is a possible process. And her data are from Shona, which is from Zimbabwe. So I wanted to sort of do some experimental work where I wanted to sort of question this ternarity domain. So is it the case that it's not really a ternary domain, or is it just an overshoot, a phonetic overshoot, so it's not something which is in the phonology? So in trying to sort of understand whether this is cognitively represented, I'm trying to answer whether this is something which is in the phonological system, in our cognitive system, or whether this is something which is just on the surface. Or is it just allomorphy, actually? And it's not so much that you think that it's ternary or not. It's just a bit like, maybe I spread to the end and maybe I don't. So how much does it have to be that it's actually ternary? And I'm not sure the experiment answers that question directly, but it's really an interesting one to ask. So the research questions for this was, what is the mental representation of ternary spread? Do speakers process ternary spread specifically? And I was curious about this because when you look at experimental work on tone in Southeast Asia languages, the tone there is different, and tone is kind of represented already on each of the segments. And here I'm really trying to think about this derived tone. So there's this idea of saying you've got a va, which is underlyingly high, and the other tones just come up as a result of phonological processing. So I wanted to know, what is the status of derived tone? Is it the same as the lexical tone where we say it's really represented on a segment? And this is kind of trying to add to what the representation could be of a two-way tone contrast, in contrast to the really rich tone systems of languages like Mandarin. So as I was just saying, Mandarin, Cantonese, Taiwanese, Thai have really a high number of tones, so 4 or 9 tones. So in that sense, they are very complex. But in terms of spreading processes, they rather, you sort of have sandy rules and that kind of thing, but it's not necessarily about creating derived tones, which is how Bantu differs. So in terms of actual number of tones, Bantu languages usually have 2 or 3 tones. So there's usually a high versus nothing, or a high versus low, or a high, mid, and low. And what's interesting about Bantu in contrast to languages like Mandarin is that the tone heights are relative. So a high tone could be high if it's preceded by another high tone, but it could be produced at a relatively lower register if there happens to be a low tone following, or there happens to be a low tone preceding. So the idea of thinking in Mandarin, where you've got the levels, the 1-1 and the 4 and the 3, it's a very different conception, because a high tone doesn't sound the same in all instances. It depends on what context that it is. So psycholinguistic studies which have been done on Southeast Asian languages show that tone is processed in a similar way as segments, as vowels and consonants. And I think this is going to be a bit different for Bantu languages, because as I say, it's not something which is on each vowel of a word, because it could be also derived, because there are these spreading processes. So I want to look at 2 main experiments. So one is a production experiment focusing on ternary spread. Can speakers, if given nonce words, be able to produce a ternary spread in the right environment? And then maybe a bit more importantly, perception. Are speakers able to hear a contrast between a ternary and a binary domain when they listen to nonce words? Is that something that is really real in their representation? And then very short, which is why it's not highlighted here, is a contrast with some Chinese and German participants. And there are a few issues with these data, but I think they sort of show interesting indications to think about, maybe also for future work. So the first experiment on production, so this was tested with 23 native speakers of Bemba. They were all from a tertiary institutions. They were all students in 2 different locations. They were aged between 18 and 66. These are the subjects. And they were 15 male and 8 female, a bit of dominance of the males, because the Nortec College is a technical college which has a predominant male student body. The subjects had no prior training in tone or intonation, and they were unaware of the purpose of the experiment, and they participated for a small fee. So my explanation to the participants in terms of why are we doing this was saying, if we were going to make new words, we were going to sort of make new words because we were trying to sort of develop maybe computer language. Does this sound like a good word or not, essentially? So that this is kind of how I presented this. So the participants originated in terms of origin from the 3 main Bemba speaking areas, the ones that we saw on the map. And this is always a bit of a complex question. So if you ask people where they come from, they tend to say where their parents come from, or where actually their grandparents come from, or where they consider their ancestral home to be. So if you ask people where they come from, they say Northern Province, but essentially all of these people that took part in this experiment were born in the Copperbelt and have lived all of their lives in the Copperbelt, but their responses, which I have to sort of pay credit to, is that they say that ancestrally they come from different areas where the main dialects are spoken. So they had all spent a significant amount of time in the Copperbelt area. This is where they come from. I think there was a couple of people who had worked in different parts of Zambia, but essentially most of them were in the Copperbelt. And none of them resided in the Northern Province, at least at the time of testing. So there were 2 conditions. There was a real word condition and a nonce word condition. There were 8 stimuli for each condition, and each item consisted of trisyllabic verb stems. So something like sakula, which is the word for comb. So 3 syllables, CV, CV, CV. There were 4 additional stimuli which were used for the familiarization phase. So there was a time we spent in terms of trying to familiarize them with the task. And we also had filler items, which were mainly real words, a bit heavy on the real words, and 2 of them were nonce words. And they were a bit longer than the experimental conditions, because in the experimental conditions, we also added a subject marker, which then, if you've got a 3-syllable word and you add a subject marker, which is 1 syllable, it becomes 4 syllables. So the filler items were also 4-syllable words. For the real words, they were all existing verb stems, and they were lexically low-toned. The forms were in aspect markers. So as I said, you've got a subject marker, and then you've got an aspect or a tense marker, and then you've got the verb form. So I chose aspect markers or tense aspect markers that were low-toned because I wanted to see how tone was spreading. I think it's easier if we look at the actual data. So this is what the data looked like. So this would be the verb stem Kula, which is to comb, and then tu would be the subject marker, and this means we comb all the time. And then safuka is a nonce word, and it's exactly the same form as the other one, which has got the real word. So this would be the nonce word form, and this is the real word form. So we did the standard using, standard settings for our recordings. The procedure kind of was modified, kind of WAG tests, and we didn't use any pictures. Actually, in the trial, I used pictures, and that didn't really go down very well. So this is just trying to show you an acoustic analysis of the production of the real words and the nonce words to show that there was no difference, no significant difference in the F0 of each of the syllables for the real stem and the non-stem. So this is just to control that the non-stems looked and sounded like, importantly, like the real form. So there's no contrast, not significant on the second syllable, not significant on the third syllable, and on the fourth syllable, which is really important. So this is an example of what a nonce word looks like. And so this was a low tone, and everything else is low in the context. This is a real word. The subject marker is low, and everything else is low. So the important thing is that this preceding one for the nonce word and this one should be the same, because this is what they would hear, and they should look the same. So their task was really simple. It was, they've got the subject marker tu, which is low toned, and their task was replace the subject marker tu with va. Of course, you can express this very well by sort of saying like, it's us who are doing this task, and now I want you to say. I mean, I didn't tell them use va. I simply said, now you want to say they will do it. Essentially, you want to use the class 2 subject marker. And they just had to replace that, the tu with the va, and it's something which is really, really easy in the context. So then you get a form which is going to be like vasakula dionse, and what we want to test is, because essentially when they produce this form, what we expect is that this high tone is going to spread, and the question is, how far is it going to spread? So for a real word, we might expect that, they say it often, and therefore we expect it to be ternary, but for a nonce word, we want to see whether they are going to do the same thing, whether they are going to produce ternary spreading. So this is just telling you a little bit about how the experiment was conducted. It was individually for each of them. They were looking at a screen. They heard the sounds using headphones, and then they had to produce their own form. And they had a bit of practice before they did it, and it was really short. It was like 12 minutes for each of them. So the tonal realization on the target 3 syllables in terms of the results were annotated by 2 phonetically trained annotators. I wasn't even one of the annotators who annotated this, and they were unaware of the purpose of the experiment. And the other was another native speaker. So the items were classified in 3 ways. Did you see unbounded spreading? Did you see ternary spreading? Did you see binary spreading? This is production. So the unbounded spreading, we did see some cases of unbounded spreading, and in those cases, it always happened when there was a pause between the verb form and the following adverb. So usually we get bounded spreading when the verb is at the end of the domain. So in the very first examples that we saw, we had vakafika. If it's at the end of the word, then we have unbounded spreading. But if there's another word following, they will arrive tomorrow, vakafika mailo, then you get the binary spreading. So then what people would do sometimes in the experiment with vakafika, and then have a bit of a pause and then say mailo, almost as if it's an afterthought. It wasn't in very many cases, and this is what the results look like. So in bounded spreading, these are just raw percentages. So in 5.7%, there was unbounded spreading, but then for real words and for non-words, very high, 88.9 and 90 for ternary. And then for binary, a few cases where there was binary spread, and then in other cases where just things went a bit wrong. So the participants, in terms of production, were able to extend their spreading patterns to nonce words, from an input that consists all low tones, participants were able to produce novel forms with high tones on the first 3 syllables. And since there was no other high tone in the input, we can conclude, I think, that ternary spreading, at least for production, is phonologically real, and they are able to do this spontaneously when they have got a high-toned subject marker. So quickly moving on to perception. So we want to see the other side. So they produced it, and now we want to see if they listened to 2 words, one had ternary and one had binary spread, would they be able to tell them apart? So the experiment that we devised, and this is with a colleague from the University of Constance, Bettina Brown, I should have said that, this collaborative work. They had we did an AX experiment, so a same different task, and it was a speeded experiment with a 2000 millisecond interstimulus interval. So there was that much of time, 2000 milliseconds between the A and the X. So they had to then decide whether it was the same or different. So you hear 2 words, are they the same or different? And I think this amount of time is exactly the amount of time that previous work has shown that for this interstimulus interval, you are tapping into phonological representations. So the participants were identical from experiment 1 and experiment 2, and they first did the production and then they did the perception. So they contrasted binary versus ternary spread in nonce words, but we also thought we should try it for real words. But for real words, of course, we thought either of 2 things could happen. Could they distinguish the 2 words because they are real based on dialect? So could they say, if they had 2 words and one has got binary spread and one has got ternary spread, could they say they're different because one person sounds like my grandmother, who comes from the north and therefore speaks a binary dialect, and the other one sounds like my father or sounds like myself because I speak I speak a Copperbelt ternary dialect. So that could be one thing that could happen. So they could reliably just rely on dialect discrimination, or we would expect that they could be a lexical effect because they would easily be rooted to thinking this is just the same word, so that they would not be relying on the tone anymore, and they would be relying on the segmental structure. So they just think like it's the same form. And actually, I can give it away now already that that's precisely what they did. The second one, they happened to be a lexical effect. But we also thought that we wanted to have a further control condition where we contrasted a similar tonal difference. So it's not ternary binary, but a contrast in terms of height, which is something that doesn't exist in the language, because we wanted to show a phonologically contrastive condition versus a non-phonologically contrastive condition, and see whether they were really responding to the experiment and whether we could think it was reliable that they were discriminating a phonological contrast. So I'll skip this because it's a little bit complex, but here, this is the really important thing. So there were 4 conditions, and the first one is phonologically contrastive. So either you hear binary ternary, and the way the data was formed is that they had a real word suffix, so they've got ba, and then they've got a non-stem, and then binary ternary, where it's all a real word. And then the non-phonologically contrastive condition was one where we had a high-mid versus high-high, and there is no mid-tones in Bemba. That's the crucial thing. And then high-mid versus high-low. And in each of these cases, in the non-phonologically contrastive cases, the second one, the 2, condition 3 and 4, it was always a real prefix followed by a nonce stem. So essentially, we just wanted to see, can they hear a difference in the tone? So there were 8 stimuli, like in the production experiment, each for the real and for the nonce words, and there were 16 nonce words which acted as fillers. And what the detail there is saying is just that we used the same subject marker. So we used a or va as a subject marker, and the tense aspect markers we used are ka and la. And the subject markers that we used were high-toned versus low-toned tense aspect markers. So then the forms would be like what we see at the bottom of this page. So tekeva is a nonce word, and then the a is the third singular subject marker, and then ka is a prefix. So here you would expect that there would be a high tone here, and it would spread here, and it would spread here. And so you could have one spread where you've got binary and one spread where you've got ternary, and you play these two one after the other, and you want them to tell you whether it's the same or whether it's different. The stimuli in the high, mid, and high, high, and the high, mid, and high, low, which was the second condition, which is giving us a non-phonological contrast, they used the same real prefixes, so we didn't change that at all. So that was all the same, but the stems were all nonce words. I think I already said that. So there was 16 fillers as well, which also had nonce prefixes. So something like fali masa, where the fa is supposed to be the prefix, and the rest of it, is all nonce words. So what they would see in terms of what we mean by high, mid, and high, low, it's all 4 syllables. So they would have a form which would look like the middle of the page. So you've got high, high, mid, mid, versus high, 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 high. So a whole level high. So if you hear a high, high, mid, mid versus a level high, can you hear a contrast or can't you? So all of the experimental items were produced twice and recorded by a native speaker of Bemba. A single speaker was used for all of them because we didn't want to have any changes in voice characteristics to avoid the listener judgment. And we did this, with standard settings for recordings in a sound attenuated room at the University of Essex. So this is just to give you a picture of what the binary versus ternary forms looked like. So the one at the top is the one which is binary. And if you look at the here, the sort of pitch tracks, the contrast is really, really minimal. But on the top one, the high is held a little bit more steadily than it is in the second one. So the second one is supposed to be, or is the binary one, where you're spreading only on 2 and you're already curving downwards. So the contrast is very different. But to give you a bit of hope, there was a significant difference in F0 of that third syllable, which is the crucial one, which shows us that in the ternary spread, the average F0 was 181 hertz, and the binary one was 159, and there was a contrast or a difference between them of 21 hertz, which was statistically significant. So it means that the third syllable, in each of these cases, the ku were distinct. So this was a high ku, and this was a low ku. So this is kind of what they're listening to. In the high mid versus high high, this is what the structures looked like. So this was one where it was high high and then mid mid. They would hear this form and they are contrasting it with something which has got all high. So the high is sustained. It's much more straight right through the end, and here it's 2 highs and then and 2 mids. This is the high, high, mid, mid, as we just saw. And then this is the high, high versus low, low. And here there's a sharp fall on this high because there are 2 lows following. And this is again to do with the relative nature of tone in Bantu, that a high tone, this high tone is not going to be at the same level as this one because there's a low tone that's following. So they really look at least and sounded quite different. So this is just showing you again the F0 values to show that the relevant syllables which needed to be different were indeed different, and there was a pairwise comparison that we did for F0 values which showed that there was a significant difference between the 2 forms of the words that were being compared. So essentially we were trying to test whether speakers would hear a perceptual difference which was indeed significantly different and which was there. The same thing with the ternary versus binary. So here we are comparing the ternary versus binary difference and the one where we are talking about the height of the tone. So comparing between the binary ternary and the ones where we are looking at high, mid, and high, high, or high, mid, and high, low, there was a difference between those forms. And similar conditions and similar procedure in terms of how they did the experiment, and just in terms of the pseudo randomization of the 14 trials that they had to do, that you sort of take care to make sure that not the same forms are following each other, but done automatically. So coming to the results, the responses were converted to D scores, and I'm not a stats person, but what I understand by these exciting D scores is that they measure the sensitivity to a contrast. So they are based on the correct detection of an existing contrast in a data sample, or also on false alarm, the detection of a contrast that is not present in a signal. So we want to see whether, if they have a higher D-score, then they show that they detect a contrast in the data. I think that's the most crucial thing to take away from it. So for the current data set, a D-score which is larger than 1.4 signals a significant sensitivity to the respective contrast. Essentially, you have to have a way of evaluating whether they have reached a threshold which tells you whether they hear a contrast or not. And this is what this D-score is giving us. So 1.4 and above tells us that they can hear a contrast, a difference. So we first compare the participants' sensitivity to the binary versus ternary spread nonce condition to the ones which is about the height nonce conditions. And then we'll consider the real situation. So for binary ternary, there was a main effect of condition. So participants were significantly more sensitive to a distinction between binary versus ternary. So they were able to hear a difference between binary versus ternary, but they were not able to hear a difference between high, high, mid, word one, versus a second word which has got all high, the ones we just saw in the spectrograms. Nor were they able to hear the contrast between high, high, mid, mid, and high, high, low, low. And the difference, the fact that the difference between the two height ones was not significant in terms of how they behaved towards them. So the binary ternary, they were able to hear the height of the vowels of the tone they were not able to hear. So this is the contrast. So for binary ternary, they performed above 1.4 D-score, and for hearing tonal height, they performed very badly, just above 1. For the real words, the results show a main effect of condition. So participants were less sensitive to a difference in tone spreading when the stimuli were real words. So when they listened to real words and they were asked, essentially, is there a difference between a real word and a non-word? They were less good at it. They were not able to do it. And I think our explanation for this is that there was a lexical effect. So essentially, when they heard a real word, they assumed that it's just the same, which another way of saying that would be that the segmental structure or the segmental forms seem to rank higher than the tone sensitivity in the case where they had real words, which is what I'm sort of saying here. So finally, I'm coming to this final little experiment, which is just only a couple of slides and then I'm done. So to establish that there was no other factor that affected the participants' performance in the real versus nonce words, we tested the same conditions with Chinese and German speakers, keeping in mind that Chinese is a tone language, but has a very different kind of tone system. So the levels are important for Chinese. And then using German speakers, also because my collaborator is from Constance, but because it's a language which has got stress. So it's a totally different system. So the Chinese participants were all from the University of Essex students. We controlled for the fact that they spoke Mandarin, Chinese, and then the German participants were all from the University of Constance, so 14. So this is the data that come out. So this is the difference between real words and nonce words. And what you see for the Chinese and the German speakers, there is no statistical difference between real word or nonce word. So their performance on real word versus nonce word was pretty much the same. So the lexical effect only affected the Bemba speakers, that the red bar shows that for real words, they did much worse than they did on the blue bars. And the performance of all of the participants, the Bemba speakers, the Chinese speakers, the German speakers, is the same for the blue bar. So essentially, it means that the lexical effect is a real one for the Bemba speakers because they associate a meaning to these words. Whereas for the Chinese and German speakers, these words don't have any meaning. They are just forms. They perform the same on the two, on the real words and on the nonce words. So in the nonce word condition, there was no effect of group. So all groups had the same p-values. In the real condition, there was a group effect. The Chinese speakers were actually better than the Bemba speakers, and the German speakers were better than the Bemba speakers. So here this is now talking about when it comes to the two levels. So when it comes to levels of tone, the Chinese speakers performed better than the Bemba speakers on these Bemba forms and on the nonce forms because they have a higher sensitivity to length, to height, tone height, in contrast to the German speakers who performed at chance level. So for the Bemba speakers, there was no effect, no interaction. So the same. Chinese speakers here, a contrast, they could hear the contrast between high, high, mid, mid versus all high, or high, high, mid, mid versus high, high, low, low. So when we are moving in height, the Chinese speakers were sort of able to hear the contrast, but the Bemba speakers were not, and the German speakers who don't have tone and have stress performed at chance level. Think we didn't do any ones with the low tone, so I'll skip this one. So the perception task findings, the Bemba listeners are very sensitive to the difference between binary and ternary spread in the non-lexical conditions. So in those cases where we used nonce words, they were able to perform the task perfectly well. But there was a strong lexical effect when real words were used, showing that the tonal information was overridden by segmental information. So subjects could not have relied on identifying the two different dialects, but rather it was much more about the contrast between segmental and tonal information. So if the segmental material is triggered in terms of the lexical input, then the tone seems to be blocked. This is an effect which has also been noted in stressed languages where there seems to be a higher sensitivity to segmental material, which results in lexical effects. So in some of the work on French that has been done in the literature, we see this effect as well. So there was a significantly better perception of a phonologically relevant contrast, so the binary ternary spread, phonologically relevant in Bemba, than for a non-phonologically relevant contrast, which was this. It was a real contrast phonetically, but it wasn't a phonological contrast. And this to say then that what they were sensitive to was something which was phonological, which was something which was cognitive in terms of their representation. So that's the finding there then. Going to skip future investigations in the interest of getting some questions, and I'll come to the conclusions really quickly. So although phonology suggests that a ternary spread domain cannot be achieved by one rule, of course there's more recent work where people are happy to say this. What we see, at least from the experimental work, is that this discrimination of nonce words is happy to rely on contrasting a binary versus a ternary domain, and that this is something that is represented in the mental representation for speakers of Copperbelt Bemba. So the validity of ternary spread was supported by the fact that speakers are able to extend their mental knowledge of ternary spread in the production of nonce words. So that was in experiment 1. In contrast to Southeast Asia language tone, Bantu tone is not represented as part of a segment, and we know this already from the work of John Goldsmith in autosegmental phonology. So derived tones have a status in phonological processing, at least for Copperbelt Bemba speakers, and they act as a discourse marker in phonological phrasing, which was one of the crucial things that they are used for. So one of the questions that one can have is, why do you do this? You do this because you're trying to signal something, but you signal it in a very concrete and specific way with this ternary spreading. And I'm done. Thank you very much for listening.
Excellent. Nancy, thank you very, very, very much for the talk. I think it was excellent in terms of introducing everyone to the puzzling character of this phenomenon of ternary spread, and how once we see phenomena of this type, we need to sort of pick apart at them and see what is their distribution dialectally, how do they change in time and in space, and what's their psychological reality. And I think you did that in a wonderful way, especially with these different tests in production and in perception, and with comparison with baselines with speakers of other languages. So indeed, very convincing that this is psychologically real. I'd like to open up the floor for the moment if there are any questions. So you can type your questions, folks, in Portuguese or in English. I'll be happy to translate them and to convey them to Nancy. Just give everyone a few moments. We have some thanks. I guess you can't see the chat, Nancy, but the variety of thank yous and obrigados and thanks a lots, and so a variety of expressions of gratitude here in the chat. Let me just type here.
Okay.
Okay, we have a question here by Gian Damoulakis, and he asks Nancy, so how do these patterns of ternary and binary spreading, how do they affect the question of mutual comprehension or mutual intelligibility between Copperbelt and Northern Bemba?
Great, yeah, great question. Thank you very much for that. I'm seeing a bit of freezing, so tell me if I'm freezing. I'm okay?
Yeah, it's good, it's good.
Okay, excellent. Yes, I think in terms of intelligibility, it doesn't really affect it very much at all. And I think speakers are quite insensitive to there being a difference. I think in terms of intelligibility, it's fine, but of course it's the kind of thing which speakers say. I think like people can notice or think, where do you come from? So you can use it to contrast people to sort of say, I think you where do you come from, or what dialect do you speak? So it could be something which could be a marker sociolinguistically of contrast between I think you might come from there, or I think you might come from there. It's a little bit like, maybe it's not quite the same, but it's almost a little bit like if you think of Brazilian Portuguese and European Portuguese, you can talk to each other and you understand each other perfectly well. But at the same time, you are able, because in particular for some phonological pronunciations, you're able to sort of say, oh, I think you are a speaker of European Portuguese rather than Brazilian Portuguese, for example. So it's in that kind of ballpark where it might help you to distinguish where people come from or you want to place people. But in terms of communication, there isn't really very much of a hindrance, because it is just it's an intonation thing. And when you start looking at bigger structures, so one of the things that I do here, I was just looking at single words, but one of the things that I also do is to look at intonation. And then if you start looking at bigger chunks, like if you look at the production of questions, or huge chunks like a whole declarative sentence, then the differences starts coming out even a little bit more. So some of the work that I'm doing currently is more on bigger chunks, and that you can really actually now move it into the realm of intonation and start realizing that you're actually hearing different intonational patterns. One of the projects that I have currently is trying to work on the intonation of different dialects of Bemba, to try and see how do the intonational patterns differ, and how much can we say it's influenced by maybe the languages that are spoken around people. So thank you very much for the question. That was really great.
Yeah, I think it also raises, it's an excellent question. I think it also raises, you mentioned a lot of other Bantu languages that have this phenomenon of ternary spreading, but I guess one might wonder, is there any way that you can map them, if there's a common origin of this pattern geographically, and there's contact and diffusion, or if this is something that has arisen independently in a number of varieties. And when you mention intonation, I thought of not necessarily just Brazilian Portuguese versus European Portuguese, but American English versus British English. Yes, no question. So for example, did you bring your umbrella versus did you bring your umbrella? So after the bre, that final syllable will, in one case, sort of retain, and whether you might see this ternary phenomena as kind of that well-described pattern of high tone spread in Bantu, where you have a particular tonal target, but then in some cases you just carry over one, and in other cases you don't, and whether it's the kind of grammaticalization. I mean, I think Jean's question exactly points to the fact that this feature, this dialect feature, is somehow something that is at the level of not impeding mutual intelligibility. It's almost like a particular phonological carryover or stylistic effect that's somehow been grammaticalized. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah, that's true. And I think one thing that is different between the two dialect areas is also that in the northern in the northern area, the dialects there are all amongst other Bemba dialects. I think I was saying that at the start, that it is languages which are very similar, which are next to each other, whereas in the Copperbelt, there are other languages. And I think which we haven't done yet is to sort of think about where did this ternary spread come from? And it may well be that it's something to do with the other languages which are in the Copperbelt. So when, speakers moved from the northern province and went to the Copperbelt, there are other Bantu languages which are spoken, and what would be nice to see would be to see whether they are, what the tonal spreading patterns of those languages are. So one of the big languages which was there is another language which is called Lamba, and in Lamba it would be interesting to see, I've done some work on the tense aspect system of Lamba, and there's a bit of similarities with Bemba, but there are also some differences. And in terms of what the intonation sounds like for Lamba, it really does sound, distinctly different. So it could be that there was some borrowing of Bemba from Lamba that added this extra spread, which has now been laid onto the sort of Copperbelt Bemba dialect. So I think there's certainly really, really huge mileage to be gained in Bemba in the Copperbelt being spoken in a place surrounded by other Bantu languages, which also have tone, and therefore would influence, what the tone development would be like for Copperbelt Bemba in this particular context. So yes, Gian, thank you very much for that question.
Wonderful. I'm just going to see if there are any other questions here in the chat. Pause for a few seconds, although we're close to our time marker. Let's just see. No, at the moment, not any other forthcoming questions. So what I would like to do is thank you one more time. And it's very clear, I think, to all of us here that this is a very wide-ranging area of work. As you just mentioned, there's things that can be looked at with respect to Lamba. There's the perceptual angle. There's the actual representation, right? I mean, here we're essentially dealing with the old canard of, does phonology count past 2? And so you've answered that question in such a wide and rich range of answers, and I'm sure that we can stay tuned with your work for many years to come, and hopefully have you for a version 2.0 in Brazil someday. And until then, thank you very, very much, Nancy, for participating on behalf of the Programa de Pós-Graduação em Linguística, and thank you very much to our organizers for all of their efforts here with the technical side. Have a wonderful weekend, everybody.
Thank you very much, and thank you.
Wait. We have a question. We have a question. So Wellington asks, would it be possible to have access to the 3 experiments that you have done to test tone? And is this on your website, or is there a place where people can find some of this work?
Yes, I think certainly. I mean, there's a paper, and I'm happy to sort of to talk to anyone. There's at least you can get the paper on a paper where we've written on this on ResearchGate or academia. It certainly is there and kind of explaining all of the details. But if you would like more details, I would be more than happy to to sort of pass any information on you.
Yes, Wellington says that he's working on the Nambikwara language, which is also a tonal language, and he'd be very interested in looking at your work and possibly.
Oh, fantastic! Yeah. There's so much stuff that's going on in tonal systems. It would be really fantastic to sort of see work in other languages, and also experimental work on tone, because we just don't, whenever we see it, it's always on Chinese and Mandarin, and that's really great, of course, but it would really be nice to sort of see it also from other families as well, from different kinds of tone systems. So that's really great. So thank you very much for the invitation. I was very thrilled to be here. Muito obrigada. Thank you very, very much.
Okay. Bye-bye, everyone, and I hope you are able to keep in touch. I hope that these kind of connections, these transatlantic connections, are ones that can foster some new dialogues.
Yes, absolutely. So please get in touch, Wellington. You have my email address there if you need it.